Hello, Giants fans, and welcome to a new edition of the Valentine's Views podcast here on Big Blue View Radio. If you're watching us on YouTube, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you're listening across the Big Blue View Radio network, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. We are just a few days away from the 2023 NFL Draft. We've talked to all kinds of experts here on the podcast to help you guys get some background, get some insight into how things might go in the draft for the Giants. And today we turn to one of Big Blue View's own, Tony DelGenio, to help us talk about what we might expect from the Giants. How you doing, Tony?
I'm doing just fine, Ed. How are you?
I'm good. Hey, I wanted to start with a piece that you did Sunday at Big Blue View that I found fascinating. Basically, you looked at how the draft could unfold using basically, I think it was 4 different philosophies. And I'm always fascinated by this because if you read the Big Blue View mailbag, I get questions year after year after year. Well, shouldn't the Giants take position, whatever, wide receiver in round 1, and then cornerback in round 2, and center in round 3, and linebacker in round 4, and safety in round 5. And I tell people over and over and over, the draft doesn't work that way. Yes, you may have certain needs going into the draft, but general managers always say need has to match value. You don't pick position A just because that might be your biggest need. If there's no value there. And I was just fascinated because it's got to be, to do it right, it's value, need, and positional value as well that all sort of have to match up. And to me, it's the smart teams that consider all of those things when they draft.
Yeah, and I'm no different from anyone else out there in fandom who roots for the Giants or any NFL team, I'm sure. When I do a mock draft, I'm definitely thinking about the Giants' needs. And so this year, when I've been doing mocks, I think about cornerback, I think about wide receiver in particular, because those are 2 high positional value positions, both of which I feel the Giants need to add someone in. And so when I'm doing a mock in round 1 at number 25, that's what I'm looking for. And if there's nobody good enough, then I look at my screen and I say, well, what am I going to do now? and right. And so it's a natural thing to want to plug holes. And there's no doubt that general managers are looking to plug holes in the draft also. They're aware of where their team's weak and where they want to get better. But I think they're more aware than most of us are. Most of us amateurs like me are in understanding, what value actually means in a given position in the draft. And that's where one of the many ways we part company with the people who do this for a living.
Absolutely. And, Big Blue View readers will find on Monday morning, they will find our annual big board, which will go through the first 4 or 5 rounds of players and where Chris Flum and Nick Filato, who work together on our big board, where those guys see each prospect rated. And the reason that I bring it up is it's really easy to look at Daniel Jeremiah's top 150 or whatever website you want to look at, the top 150, and say, well, that's the best player on the board. That should be the guy that we pick. And the draft just doesn't work that way. Every single team in the NFL is going to enter Thursday night and Friday and Saturday with a different big board. And that's because they have a different general manager. They have different coaches. They have different schemes. They may be in different places. The Philadelphia Eagles and Kansas City Chiefs, for example, are in a different place than the New York Giants are, just in terms of what their ultimate goals are for 2023. And every team is going to look at it differently, have different needs and all of that. So there is no such thing as a consensus big board. And that, I say these things year after year after year, and I guess, I'm kind of blue in the face from saying them, I guess.
And actually, there's another fascinating thing about this all, which of course must play out in who winds up going to the Super Bowl frequently and who never goes to the Super Bowl and is always drafting early, and that is different general managers and their staffs have different skills in evaluating talent too, and it's not just knowing their needs, but some of them aren't as good as identifying the crucial things about prospects as others are, and uh, you can see that in the professional draft analysts who create these big boards. They disagree a surprising amount on not all prospects, but on certain prospects. There's actually a lot of disagreement among the so-called professional draft analysts about who's worth a first round grade, who probably is more of a second or third round guy. And that's one of the things that I find fascinating in the whole lead up to the draft is reading about how these different people who spend a lot more time than I ever will in my life analyzing prospects, watching film and so on, how they come to such different conclusions about the strengths and weaknesses, which strengths are fixable, or which, weaknesses are fixable, and which ones are going to be difficult to fix, and so on and so forth. That's one of the many things that makes it such a fascinating process.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Tony, because I answered a mailbag question over the weekend, which basically talked about exactly that. How do teams scout? How is it that they come up with such differing opinions on certain players? And the example that I used was Quentin Johnston, the very polarizing wide receiver from TCU. And you and I have talked about the scouting reports and the big board at 33rd team. Now I have tons of respect for all the work they do at 33rd team. There's tremendous value in getting opinions, getting information, getting insight from the folks over there, not only Mike Tannenbaum and Joe Banner, but from the scouts over there. TJ McCrate, who is their lead scout, is a guy with 25 years of experience in the NFL. He's been a college scouting director. He's been a player personnel director in the NFL. And what's really interesting when you talk about his entire staff, McCrate's entire staff at 33rd team has NFL experience. They have Quentin Johnston ranked as the top wide receiver in the class, and stunningly to me, they have him ranked as the number 2 overall prospect in the draft. Now, the flip side of that is Matt Waldman, who runs the rookie scouting portfolio, has been doing so for almost 20 years. Matt studies exclusively, if folks don't know, he studies exclusively quarterback and other offensive skill positions, wide receiver, running back, and tight end. That's all he studies. He's been doing it for almost 20 years. NFL teams use his work. I know that his rookie scouting portfolio guide probably sits on the desks of a lot of general managers around the NFL. Matt Waldman, in a podcast a few weeks ago, told me that he'd be perfectly happy as a general manager to draft Quentin Johnston in the 3rd round. And the difference is they both see the same thing in terms of his skills and his particular flaw. They just see a different reason for it. McCrate sees concentration drops, and whereas Matt Waldman sees some serious flaws in the technique that Quentin Johnston uses to catch the ball and has doubts that he'll ever be able to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, to me, it's the perfect illustration of how very smart people who are very good at this and know an awful lot about talent. I mean, Matt Waldman has been right about tons of players over the years that the NFL undervalued. but it's an amazing example of how people can look at the same thing and see something completely different.
Yeah, so I bought the rookie scouting portfolio this year for the first time ever, and it's just hard to put down because he goes into all kinds of detail about all different aspects of players. And Quentin Johnston was one of the first guys that I read about because I was so curious as to what he had to say about him. And one of the things that people say about Quentin Johnston is that for a big guy, he doesn't actually make use of his height because he's more of a body catcher than a guy who puts his hands out and grabs the ball, high up, high points the ball and makes use of his size and everything to do it. And I got a good laugh this morning when I logged into Big Blue View and saw Chris Flum's analysis of Quentin Johnston. And Chris also brought up the point that, among other things, he's a body catcher. And before I even read the article, I saw the picture that he chose to put at the top of the article, and sure enough, it's a picture of Quentin Johnston making a catch in his body rather than going up with his hands and getting it. And I said, "Oh, I know what he's going to say about Quentin Johnston."
Yeah, it's it is interesting because part of the other thing with scouting and evaluating and projecting is these guys are all very young players. They're not by and large finished products. And projecting what you think they'll become is part of the deal. And it's impossible to do in a lot of ways because honestly, as much as the NFL tries and as much time as they spend and as many people as they talk to and as much information as they gather about so many of these players, you can't always tell what is in a guy's heart and what is in a guy's head. And evaluators will tell you that they don't miss on talent evaluation. They don't miss on judging measurables and skill sets and all of that. When they miss, it's because the person almost always is not what they thought he was.
And I'm guessing that is a decent part of what the Giants and any NFL team, not just the Giants, but what the Giants are looking for when they pick the 30 guys that they decide to bring in for personal visits. They think there maybe, I mean, I'm sure there are other things they're looking for, and I'm sure they do medical evaluations and other kinds of testing and things like that. But I'm sure they're looking for that intangible component of things and how well they think this guy, how much this guy really wants it and how much he's willing to do to correct the things that he's not doing right in order to get there. And the Giants have actually had, I think, two fascinating experiences with people in recent years that are very relevant to this question, and they play almost the same position on the Giants. One is Andrew Thomas on the left side of the offensive line, who came into the league and was terrible his first season, mostly the first half of his first season, but they managed to finally get corrected the things that he wasn't doing well, and now he's arguably one of the top few left tackles in the NFL. And now you've got Evan Neal on the right-hand side, who came in with such a great pedigree, and he also had an awful time in his first year. And all Giants fans are saying, okay, well, can he make the adjustments? Can he correct the things that he was doing wrong? I don't think anyone doubts his will, his desire to be great, from what I've read. And the question is, can he make those changes that he needs to take full advantage of the talent that he has at the NFL level?
Well, absolutely. And the example that comes up with Giants fans all the time is Eric Flowers.
Speaking of
Okay.
offensive tackle,
Speaking of the devil, yes. And one of the things I, for a long time, was always critical of Jerry Reese in a lot of ways. I thought, there once upon a time the Giants had an offensive line that was the best in football. And I thought there was a time period from, I think, 2009 when they drafted Will Beatty in the second round to 2013 when they finally drafted Justin Pugh, I think, as the 8th or 9th offensive tackle taken in the first round of that draft, where they did not use any day one or day two resources on the offensive line. And you made a point earlier that I think is relevant. I think part of that was because Jerry and his staff were hyper focused on skill positions and finding playmakers. They could have, the year they chose Odell Beckham, they could have chosen Aaron Donald, or they could have chosen Zach Martin. They chose the playmaker. I have come to believe, after watching some of the picks that were made on the offensive line during Jerry's time, that part of the reason why they didn't draft offensive linemen was because they didn't feel like they had a staff that was really good at identifying and evaluating offensive line play. I
Yeah,
really
and
Go
and
ahead.
I think that what we're seeing now in the NFL is that offensive and defensive lines are pretty important to success in the NFL. I mean, I think people have known that about the offensive line for a while. As far as the defensive line goes, I think in recent years there's been much more of an emphasis on the edge defenders, and because they do the pretty stuff, the high the high attention stuff of sacking the quarterback a lot. But there's been a little bit of a renaissance, I believe, in the interior defensive line, and how important it is to get that right too. And I think Giants fans saw that last season when, once Nick Williams went down with an injury, they had nobody inside to stop the run when Dexter Lawrence and Leonard Williams were not on the field, either one of them. They were missing a guy on the inside to stop the run, and it really hurt the Giants in the second half of the season when that happened. And so, for that reason, it wouldn't shock me if the Giants went defensive tackle very early in this draft, even though it's not necessarily what I'm expecting. But I think this idea of building both sides of the line is one that's really gained some currency in the NFL.
Tony, I think that you were talking about both lines, and we've talked about the draft in pretty general terms up to this point. I think that's a good point for us to really dive in and sort of look at different scenarios for the Giants and different ways that they can go here in round one. And we know, first of all, the Giants have 10 picks. There's 7 rounds. Even with those 10 picks, whether they move around the board, they're not going to get everything that they would like to get. They're not going to solve every need. They're not going to fill every hole. And even if Joe Shane is the best general manager on the planet, not every pick that he makes is going to hit. It's just not possible for those things to happen. You do the best you can to, you hope need and value, match up as often as possible, and you build the roster the best you can. And before we get into, debating the different ways the Giants can go, the other thing I will say is people get hyper focused on the upcoming season. The draft is not necessarily about 2023. It's not necessarily about the upcoming season. There are all kinds of factors. What kinds of play, who's on the last year of their contract? Who are you going to have a guy ready for, in 2024, a guy ready to step in to replace? What do you have contract wise coming up the next couple of years? You're building for the long term. So it's not just about 2023. So, and I think, and you have any thoughts on that idea? Because I do think people get hyper focused on, we need this to win right now.
Yeah, so like any Giants fan, I want the Giants to win the Super Bowl this coming season, right? So who doesn't, right? And
Right.
but I'm realistic enough to know that there's still a ways away from that, and I think you could see it last year in their games against the Eagles. There were just a lot of positions at which the Giants are not yet ready to compete with a team like the Eagles, and you don't fix that overnight. And we know that coming in last season, the Giants seemed to be pretty devoid of talent, and their coaching staff did an amazing job, and I think getting the most out of what they had. but you reach a limit with that, and eventually you have to add talent. And I think they've done a pretty good job in the offseason, Joe Shane and his staff, in bringing in talented players. So I was very excited about Darren Waller, and I think Paris Campbell was a nice ad. Bobby McCain is a nice ad, given that Julian Love left. Raheem Nunez Roches was a nice ad for some run stuffing in the middle, and so on. I'm forgetting about a couple of other people. Oh, of course, Bobby Okereke in at linebacker. I think that's maybe one of their most important acquisitions to shore up what is maybe the weakest of all positions on the Giants. But you know that there's a lot more of that needs to be done, and the odds that the Giants will actually compete for a Super Bowl title this year are very slim. I think there's just too much that needs to be added still, and too much experience that needs to be had before they can legitimately do that. Once you have a taste of the playoffs, like we had with them last season, of course you want to get back to the playoffs, and I don't think that's an unreasonable goal to think of for a fan, that they get back to the playoffs and do a decent job. But if you're actually going to go all the way, then I think you're looking at least one more year, if not 2 years, before you can do that. Obviously, if you catch lightning in a bottle, go for it. But you don't plan, I think, with this year necessarily in mind.
No, it's not an all-in to win this year type of circumstance. I think that Joe Shane has continued to make decisions throughout the offseason. I mean, yes, he picked up Darren Waller and he paid, fairly big money for Bobby Okereke, but I think that he's still in that situation where he has to keep long-term in mind whenever he makes any of these financial decisions. But I do want to talk about, at pick 25, one of the really interesting things was a year ago, Giants had the 5th and the 7th pick. And in any draft, you can pretty much identify between 15 and 20 players that are pure first round players. And you can generally identify the players who are going to go in the first 5 to 10 picks. And I mean, they may not always go in the exact order you expect, but you can generally identify the top 10 players. And Joe said last year, with 7 picks, he wanted to enter the first round of the draft, having identified 7 players he would be happy to choose at. And I think he said they ended up with 6. So there was, they ended up with 6 guys who they felt were value in those first 7 picks, and they got 2 of them. So, and we can argue about whether or not, Evan Neal was the right pick over Charles Cross, but we'll see. We'll see about that in a couple of years. But it's a lot different when you're picking at 25. You can't sit there and identify 25 guys you'd be happy to pick. You don't know what the 24 people in front of you are going to do.
Mm-hmm.
That said, you've done a zillion mock drafts on your own, and I've done a mock draft every Sunday since the end of January. And truth be told, I've probably done 5 times that many, just for fun and just to see, what things look like, on using different simulators and different big boards and all of that. Tell me if you agree with me. I think there are 4 scenarios and 4 different ways the Giants can go, whether they trade up or trade down. It's wide receiver, it's cornerback, it's interior offensive line, most likely center, or it's what we'll call outliers, which might be whoever they see as value. If they don't see value at 25 in cornerback or wide receiver, it could be defensive line. It could be an edge guy, which wouldn't be my favorite pick. It could be safety Brian Branch. It could be a guard like Osiris Torrance if they think he's the best value. But it could be a linebacker. I mean, early in the process, I was giving the Giants Drew Sanders all the time, and I've heard the name Jack Campbell thrown around, which I think that's too early for Campbell, but who knows? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, do you agree with me that there are really, 4 basic scenarios?
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think in my own mind, wide receiver and cornerback in some order are number 1 and 2 most likely for them to seek, not necessarily most likely for them to get, because we don't know who's going to go off the board. And in
Right.
one piece I did about a week ago, the top 4 wide receivers and cornerbacks were often all off the board by the time we got to number 25. So you never know how that's going to go. But I would say, given the availability of value players at all 4 positions, my guess is that cornerback and wide receiver are their first 2 priorities in some order. My gut feeling says wide receiver, only because the cornerback class may be somewhat deeper than the wide receiver class at the top this year. That's just a judgment on my part, which may or may not be true. But barring those,
Daniel Jeremiah agrees with you, by the way.
okay.
Jeremiah was asked during his pre-draft conference call last week with the media. Someone asked him when it came to the Giants if the choice in round 1 and 2 was cornerback and wide receiver, which order would he go in? And he said exactly that. He said he would go wide receiver first because the talent on day 2 would be deeper at corner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I would feel the same way. So if I'm sitting there in front of my TV on Thursday night at around, I don't know, 10 p.m. or whenever it is that the Giants are going to wind up drafting. Oh my God, it's so late.
I know.
It's going to be terrible waiting so long, right? But that's, of course, but that's what
take
you
a
want.
nap, Tony. Take
That's
a nap.
what you want. You don't want your team to be drafting top 10 all the time, right? But if I'm sitting there
and getting a nap.
Yeah, and if we get there, and Jacksonville chooses, and I see Zay Flowers is still on the board, or Jordan Addison is still on the board, or Deonte Banks is still on the board, then I'm looking at that and I'm saying, oh, okay, yeah, one of those 3 guys I want them to take, and which one I'd probably opt for Jordan Addison first, maybe, but I'm not sure about that, whether I'd take him over Zay Flowers or not. But I'd probably take both of them over the cornerback Deonte Banks, just because I feel like I have a chance of getting someone good in round 2. Not as good as Deonte Banks, but good enough.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I think we could debate which guy forever. I'm a Zay Flowers guy, but I think Big Blue View listeners and readers know that at this point. I think that Flowers has a terrific skill set for what Brian Daboll and Mike Kafka want to do. But I could be wrong. Who knows? But I think where it gets really interesting, because I agree with you, I think there's that group of 4 wide receivers: Flowers, Addison, Smith and Jigba, and Quentin Johnston. And there's that group of 4 corners: Banks, Gonzalez, Porter, and Witherspoon. And it's entirely possible that all 8 of those players will be gone in the first 24 picks. Where it gets really interesting is what happens then for Joe Shane. Is Brian Branch there, the safety from Alabama, who's a player that I love? And when you think about value, he's really a slot corner. So you could say he's added value because he plays 75% of his snaps in the slot. Do you go to the next tier of wide receivers for a Jalen Hyatt? Do you go to the next tier of cornerbacks for Emmanuel Forbes, which is a pick that I would love? I don't care if he's 170 pounds or whatever he weighed at his pro day. I think he has a terrific skill set, and he has one thing that no one else in the Giants secondary has, which is the ability to take the ball away.
Yep. Yeah, I would not be upset with Emmanuel Forbes at all if those other guys are gone.
But
it gets interesting though when right then in the scenario that those top 8 at cornerback and wide receiver are gone, and you have someone like Kalijah Cansey or Brian Bresee sitting still there, two guys who could be very interesting on the interior of the defensive line, and
Yeah.
then that's the question: do you go to that next tier of wide receivers and cornerbacks, or do you go in a different direction with position? And I'm let's say confident. Okay, that's a good word. Confident that both of those guys are going to be very good defensive linemen in the NFL, and I'd love to see
And
either one on the Giants line.
and that's a position that I keep coming back to in this particular scenario. Joe Shane has said since day one of the offseason that they need to get better on the defensive line. They need more defensive linemen. And all you have to do is look down the road to the Eagles and look at how many people they can run in and out, in their front seven on defense. And you realize it's nice to have Kayvon Thibodeau and Azeez Ojulari on the edge, but we need more on the edge. It's really nice to have Dexter Lawrence and Leonard Williams, but they can't be the only quality players that the Giants have on the defensive line. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wouldn't be upset if I saw that. I think I would be upset if Zay Flowers is sitting there and they choose to bypass him, because I agree with you that I think he has a skill set that would be perfect for what the Giants need, and I feel like the Giants are a wide receiver away from having a potentially very dangerous offense this year. So I'd be sorry to see them pass up someone like that. But again, in the scenario that those kind of top 8 cornerbacks and wide receivers are gone, I will. I won't jump up and down if they go with one of those defensive tackles, but I'll be quietly satisfied. I think that they did that. I feel like it was a good use of the first round pick.
The one thing I will also say about 25 is there's a lot of talk about center. And as much as I like Joe Tipman, the consensus is John Michael Schmitz is the number one center. And there's a lot of talk about, in this particular scenario, taking a center. And I would understand that pick, but I'm not sure that I'd be in love with that pick, for the simple reason that I would understand the need, and I would understand that, if you grab Schmitz, you're grabbing a plug and play starter guy that steps right in on your offensive line. But you keep looking at it, and the more mocks you do and the more you look at probabilities, there's a half a dozen starting centers in this draft. And there's honestly a mixed bag of opinion on what order they should be placed in. I mean, Dane Brugler of The Athletic has John Michael Schmitz as a 3rd round value. There are places that have Joe Tipman as center 1 in this draft, and Oli Oluwatimi of Michigan as center number 2 in this draft. So to me, you don't necessarily have to go and get that center, on day one. To me, you make a value play there, no matter what you think it is, and go get your center later.
Yeah, and I think for Giants fans, they're so they Giants fans have so much angst about the offensive line, with good reason.
Yes.
Giants did it to them all these years.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not ridiculous that people want the offensive line so much to be improved. And really, though, the question is, where do you have to draft someone to improve a particular position? And at offensive tackle, that your chances are much better of getting someone good if you do it in the first round. And even in the top half of the first round, your chances are a lot better. But in the interior offensive line, you get good guys from all over the draft. And since none of those 4 people that you mentioned. Oh, you didn't even. I don't think you even mentioned Luke Whippler. I think it was the third. The
Right.
third you mentioned Oluwatimi. Throw in Ricky Stromberg and right and so on. So you've
Mhm.
got maybe half a dozen
Right.
guys that you could pick, and you don't know whether all of them will be good NFL players or not. And as you say, the fact that so many people looking at these same players disagree about which one is center one and which one is center number four, and which one's a first or second round value and which one's a third round value, that tells you that the differences probably are not that big, and it's not that easy to project which ones are going to be good. And if you can, all you need is one that's good.
Right.
And
And
if
I think
you don't necessarily have to get Jason Kelsey. It's nice if you
I
get Jason Kelsey, but you don't have to.
I think Whippler, for example, is everybody says, well, he's not as strong as Schmitz and he's not as strong as Steve Avila, and they worry about him getting bull rushed. But I think the reality of it is he's also 3 years younger.
Mhm.
He's 3 years younger. He's got time. He's got time to get stronger. And you also get a player with 3 years less mileage on his body. So there's
Yeah,
that factor as well.
and you mentioned the fact that he's 3 years younger. That's actually a unique feature of this draft in general, is that because of COVID, we had so many of these players deciding to stay in school an extra year. And some of these guys have like 5 years of college
Mhm.
play on their resume, and they're coming to the NFL at age 24, 25. And that's causing some people to downgrade them because they'll already be entering the NFL at a fairly old age. I mean, it's hard for me to think of 25 as old from where I stand, but
You and me both.
but I mean, people say that about, for example, Hendon Hooker at quarterback, that he's
Right.
25. It's like, well, do you want to draft a 25-year-old quarterback, or do you want to draft a 21-year-old guy? And it's like, you know what? If he's a good quarterback and I have him for 13 years instead of 15 or 17 years, if he's a good quarterback, he's a good quarterback. I'll take the 13 years of good play. And I think you can say that
Mhm.
about any of these positions. And the upside is, because they have all those years in college, they have more experience, and they might turn out to have an easier adjustment to the pros than someone who is younger.
Absolutely. It it's so interesting. We talk so much about so many of these guys and what different people see. One of the things that I did on Sunday when I did my mock draft, which turned out to be mock drafts plural, because I I just couldn't, after doing so many of these, I just couldn't settle on one exact scenario. I wound up doing a mock with trades and a mock without trades. And I think there was quite a bit of angst when I traded up in the third round for Tank Dell. And what was interesting about that was I made the 89th pick, and then I traded back into the third round to take Tank Dell. And Dell, of course, is 5'8", 163 pounds. And people were like, "How can you trade up for Tank Dell?" And I actually
People,
think I'm
people, anyone
talking.
in particular?
I was gonna say I think you were one of them, but I feel vindicated. I feel vindicated because I wake up on Sunday morning and I read Matt Miller of ESPN, his 7-round mock draft. He gave the Giants Tank Dell in the third round,
Mhm.
pretty much exactly as I did. And his explanation was that basically the same thing that I see. I don't care about how big he is. There isn't a wide receiver in this class that has a better skill set for Brian Dable and Mike Kafka than Tank Dell.
Yeah, and I think
So
that ultimately, in fairness, ultimately that's the question, is how do Shane and Dable and Kafka see a particular player fitting into the offense that they want to run. But the other point that you raise about what you did is just the whole idea of trading up rather than trading down. And I think that's going to be one of the more fascinating things about this draft. Last year, we saw Shane trade down to get extra picks. And the question is, will he trade down again this year, or is he looking to trade up with 10 picks and to unload some of those 10 picks in order to get someone that he feels is better to go up and grab? And and then that comes back to your original question about what the Giants are going to do at number 25. What if all the guys they really like are not there at 25 at all? Are they going to say, well, I'm not drafting a center at number 25, but such and such a team comes to me with an offer to drop down to number 35, and I'll give them something to do that. Maybe I'll drop to number 35 and take my center at number 35, and maybe the asset that he asked for at number 35 is not an extra pick in this year's draft. Maybe it's a nice pick in the 2024 draft, where the Giants currently only have their standard 7 picks. And if he wants to build draft equity for the future, he might actually be looking in this draft to use trades in order to acquire picks next year, which is not as satisfying as getting the extra player this year, but maybe is a good strategy. So that's yet another thing that he could do. And whether he does some of that, whether he does the regular trade down like he did last year, or whether he does trade ups, that's just going to be another one of the fascinating things to see in this draft.
Absolutely. And anyone that's been following the mock drafts that I've done, depending on who's available at 25, I'm a big fan of the trade down, especially, and maybe I'm overvaluing the 5th-year option, to be honest with you, but especially if you can entice one of those teams below you. Take Dallas at 26 and take the Eagles out of the equation. But if Kansas City wants to come up from 31, or Buffalo wants to come up from 27, and I don't think this is going to happen. I think somebody's going to jump before the Giants do. But what if Bijan Robinson is sitting there at 25? To me, he's perfect for the Buffalo Bills, who are in that win now mode, but they need somebody to hand the football to so that Josh Allen doesn't have to carry their running attack. What if the Saints or the Bengals want to come up, and grab somebody? I'm a big fan of, if your corners and wide receivers aren't there, move down a couple spots, collect another asset, maybe, as you said, an asset in this draft and maybe one in the 2024 draft, again, with the idea that this is not always just about 2023. And then you take all of those assets and you go hunting on day 2. If there's a guy that you want, if you want to move up and make sure you get the center that you want, you go get that guy. If there's a defensive tackle you want to make sure you get on day 2, you use your assets and go get that guy. So I'm a big fan of doing it that way, and getting as many picks and as much value in the top 100 selections as you can.
Yeah, and and you said forget about the Eagles and forget about the Cowboys as far as trading down, but I'm always reminding myself that the Eagles kind of kickstarted their renaissance by trading up with Dallas I'm sorry, by trading up with Dallas to get Devontae Smith, and jumping past the Giants to do that.
Yeah,
So I say never about any of those.
No, you never say never, but honestly, Tony, if it's for Bijan Robinson, do you want to be the New York Giants general manager that hands Bijan Robinson to the Eagles?
No, I don't.
So, I mean,
I would have a hard time making any kind of a trade with the Eagles.
Yeah, I would too. But honestly, I mean, we kid about that. You can't take that off the board. I mean, Dave Gettleman used to say, yeah, he would make trades with Howie Roseman if the situation was right. You can't, the Yankees and the Mets have made trades with each other. The Yankees and the Red Sox have made trades with each other. You do it if it's the right thing to do. So,
yeah.
But, but it's obviously not, not plan A. So Tony, I think we've gone on long enough here. I think we've covered most of what we need to cover in round 1. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you wanted to talk about before we wrap it up?
No, and I think not really, other than the fact that I think this is just going to be a frustrating but amazing experience for Giants fans trying to figure out what's going to happen on these next few days coming up next weekend. I think it's a little different it's a lot different from last year, where, as you say, there was a list of 6 or 7 players, and you knew
And
the Giants were going to get
last
one
year
or two.
it was just a matter of, okay, here's this small list of players. Which ones are going to sit there?
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but before we wrap it up, I have to say this. I've written it. I just find Joe Shane so refreshing sometimes, because he'll say things that are a little bit more honest and a little bit more revealing than you would expect sometimes from a lot of general managers. You know, we talk about the Evan Neal pick a year ago. He was asked on draft night, "Why'd you pick Evan Neal?" Because Ike Ekwonu was already gone. And what general manager is ever
Mhm.
says, "Well,
Mhm.
there's another player I liked better,
Mhm. Mhm.
but you know, but he was gone." You
Mhm.
know, what general manager says that? What general manager says, "Oh, I haven't talked to Saquon Barkley in 3 weeks." You know, and basically, whatever, we'll talk when we talk, you know, but I
Yeah.
mean, he's refreshingly honest and refreshingly candid about some of that, and I get a kick out of it.
And underlying it all, I think for Giants fans, he shows every indication of being very competent.
Right,
And so you have
right,
some level of confidence that he knows what he's doing. And I mean, how can you not, after what they did, in one season? That wasn't just an accident, right?
right,
And so
and
and so whatever he decides, I'll say, well, even if it's something I don't like, yeah, I'll give it a chance. Sure, I trust him.
and the reality of it is, as we talked about, there are so many directions that the Giants could go in, and so many variables before they get on the clock, that it's really unpredictable. It's a lot different place for the Giants to be in, and Giants fans to be in, than they've been in quite a while.
Yeah, and I'll take that over the alternative.
Absolutely. Hey, Tony, thank you very, very much. As always, you and I will be talking again here on the podcast on Friday morning after the Giants make their first round pick. So, folks, please look forward to that. Check out all of our draft coverage at Big Blue View. Check out our draft hub page, where we've been placing profiles, and our big board is live as of Monday morning. We've got profiles, we've got mock drafts, we've got all kinds of analysis for you. Anything we can think of to post in regards to the Giants in the draft, we're posting. So there's really no reason for you to go anywhere else, and hopefully you won't. So, Giants fans, thank you as always for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.